The last session I found fascinating, Scott from Australia, and then the questions from Ukraine. And one of the questions was, can outsiders help? And so I'm very conscious that I'm speaking from East London now. I'm not speaking from Ukraine. But I am wearing my Sunday uniform as a minister and preacher. Every Sunday I wear my Ukrainian outfit, and I will wear this until there is a just peace in Ukraine. The paper is offered as a contribution to all those seeking to understand, respond to, and help children suffering from trauma because of the war in Ukraine. This is Christians and non-Christians, professionals and parents. So it's really important to understand that what I've tried to do is to say, how could everyone who wants to help in some way where children are suffering trauma? And there are three main sources of the writing. The first is my experience, lifelong experience of living alongside children who've suffered trauma of separation and loss. This includes people who suffered trauma in the Second World War, the death of parents and the loss of their families. It secondly includes my own understanding from psychological, social, and psychotherapeutic models, but also extremely important is the Christian faith tradition, including theology, the Bible, and the human resources represented by the Christian faith. Now, underpinning what I share with you is the belief that it takes a village to raise a child. And I'm not sure whether this has been mentioned so far in the conference. It takes a village to raise a child. This is not original, but in a time of war, it's obviously important that all villages who have the well-being of the child at heart recognize that however small a part they play, whether they're road sweepers or whether they're shopkeepers, they have a part to play as members of the village. So rather than talk simply about biological parents or carers or counselors or teachers, I'm using the idea of parenting. So I'm thinking, what does it mean for any villager in Ukraine to parent a child? It concludes, the paper concludes with something really hopeful, describing a Ukrainian family who came to live with us, including a little boy who celebrated his first birthday with us. They're from Kharkiv, and his name is Tamerlan. So just one or two things about background, and then I'm going to invite you to do some drawing on a piece of paper. I hope you can get a piece of paper if you haven't already got one. So I think we have a shared understanding of trauma. So a long-term emotional reaction, conscious and unconscious, caused by a distressing event. The event may involve physical, mental, emotional, spiritual suffering, individual or collective. This sums up everything that's been said so far. In very young children, the cause of the deepest trauma of separation is deepest trauma is separation from and loss of a significant other, mother or parental figure, on whom a little one depends for survival, safety, and well-being. This has been extensively studied. So Ukraine, yes, what's happening now is unique in human history, and yet sadly, in the Second World War, there were many studies of the effect of trauma on young children as they grew up. Military conflict, of course, puts every person in a war zone at risk of injury, hunger, thirst, loss, death, and trauma, as we've already heard. And among the many long-term effects of trauma are a loss of security, trust, the will to live, identity, understanding, an inability to tune in with personal feelings or the feelings and emotions of others, a sense of helplessness, powerlessness, chronic anxiety, fear, and some of these things that, for example, Scott described, the ghostliness, the fog that there is as a result of trauma. The ways in which separation, loss, injury, suffering, and abuse in early childhood affect a growing child's feelings, moods, attitudes, and behavior throughout life have been well studied in the second half of the 20th century. And there have been major breakthroughs and understandings of the functioning of brains and memory. Neural networks are open-ended in the newborn child, and events and how the child's mother reacts to them affect not only the immediate experience and responses of a child, but lay the foundations, the patterns through emotional memories and temperament for the rest of life. So put simply, we're talking about something serious. This isn't just about something that is painful for a moment. This is about patterns for life. It follows that in cases of separation and loss, how a village, in the sense I've already described, responds to a child's pain and anguish is critically important, not just at the time of suffering and separation, but in the long term, because the known consequences, if the cries of a child go unheard and her needs unrequited, the known consequences are sadly well charted. So I come to you as someone who's lived alongside children who've suffered separation and loss, sometimes because of war. And I've collected their life stories and their case studies from children across the continents of the world. One of the things about London, it is an international city. And so as a result of living here all my life, I've had the experience of meeting people from every continent. Now, I haven't lived in or visited Ukraine, but I am familiar with Russian literature and history, including notably the Holodomor. Always difficult to know how to pronounce that in English, let alone for you. That's 1932 to 1933, which I first came to know through the harrowing descriptions of starvation and trauma by Vasily Grossman in his monumental account translated into English, Everything Flows. And more recently, my wife and I have been alongside the family from Ukraine, back to them right at the end of my paper, learning firsthand of their harrowing experiences of war, death, disruption, separation, destruction of communities, and the struggle for survival in their own family, let alone wider. There's something I think in this conference that will develop will be an enhanced, enriched vocabulary that enables us to speak inclusively, that is theologically, emotionally, psychologically, and existentially of what we're talking about. So we're trying to develop a vocabulary, and something I offer to you is this, that war zones involve nearly every possible type of pain and loss. They affect individuals and groups. But they don't have a monopoly of such comprehensive human suffering and trauma. So other events that engender this deep and extensive suffering are natural disasters, such as earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and famines. So we can learn from responses to human disasters on all continents. So rather than a simple inside-outside, Ukraine or non-Ukraine, I think we can realize we can learn from the cries and the reflections of others. And I offer this to you as an idea. In the field of sociology, one of the things I am as a sociologist is the notion of total institutions such as prisons, mental hospitals, residential schools, monasteries, convents, and so on. They have in common the fact that the whole of a person's life is lived within them while they're residents. And what I want to suggest to you is that a war zone is effectively a horrendous total institution where people find themselves living in, surviving, suffering within a bounded space. For the majority, there is no escape, no alternative, no additional place of refuge. So it's like a ghetto sealed off from the rest of the world. So sometimes, no doubt, Ukraine feels like the Warsaw Ghetto. Although the suffering of adults, parents, grandparents, relatives, neighbors, professionals, colleagues, results in trauma, this paper focuses on young children. It is a paper of hope, because for one reason, after the tsunami in 2004, I was involved in conferences with people who've been involved, and they universally said that the little child somehow represented hope in a tsunami, even a child who'd lost parents and home. So somehow, child can represent hope. The paper is in 4 parts, and what I want to do now is part 1 is to share with you 5, let's get this right, 5 elements or dimensions of trauma. Now, already these have been covered using different names, but I invite you now, if you could, to take a piece of paper and to trace round your hand. If you're right-handed, trace round your left hand, trace round the fingers, so you can then put a word with each finger. If you could do that, I'm inviting you. If this seems like going back to kindergarten, this is well and good. Kindergarten is a very good place to start. So I'm going to share with you 5 interrelated understandings or dimensions of trauma. Now, all of them are to be found in the book that is just actually going into its 3rd edition, The Growth of Love. And also, just so you know, referred to, there are 500 case studies under the title Reflections on Living with Children. All these can be got through Amazon. So 5 fingers, and number 1, the thumb. A dimension of trauma is that it undermines security. So the word I'm asking you to use there is security, whatever that is in Ukrainian, your language. It's no overstatement to describe what happens when there's a fundamental threat to the safety or security of a child is like falling into a terrifying void, dark and bottomless. I'm wanting to be serious about this. This is perhaps the ultimate fear of all human beings, represented by death itself. It's an experience of complete separation from all living things, any potential help, and somehow oneself. There is nothing to grasp or hold on to, let alone a mother's arms. There is an empty silence in place of the warmth and succor and the moving of a mother's breast and the familiar rhythms of her heartbeat and breathing. The instinctive reflex action of a child when security is threatened is to shut down all other activities in search of being held again in the absent, safe arms of the lost figure. Nothing else matters at all. Tomorrow, eating, play, and so on. And one of the reasons aggressors start wars is to create fear and terror, to demoralize, destabilize the security and the lives of those attacked by whatever means available. This is obvious, sadly, in the current conflict in Ukraine. Many children live in terror, having suffered this loss. The very ground of their being has been shattered. All security is gone. So the first concept, trauma caused by the loss of security. Secondly, we call this the index finger. The word I want to use there is boundaries. Closely associated with the loss of security caused by war is the interruption of the predictable patterns of life, its rhythms, its rituals. The breaking down of the boundaries integral to ordinary, good enough parenting and social life. Before the onset of war, I still remember the weeks before when the leader of Russia was saying there was going to be no invasion, that there was an unstated but accepted, orderly, reliable pattern of life for most children in Ukraine. with daily routines such as getting up, brushing teeth, dressing, meals, familiar places such as bed and bedroom, the sink and table in the kitchen, the sun shining through the eastern windows in the morning and the western windows in the evening, familiar voices and sounds, natural and human, and play with favorite toys and dolls and teddies. And let's not underestimate this, and animals and pets. Please hold on to the significance of animals and pets. In a moment, with the loss of separation from a parent, possibly from home itself, the child finds herself as if in suspended animation, lost and bewildered, not knowing what to expect, where they are, what will happen next. Their predicament resembles that of a fledgling bird driven out of a nest. It was friendly and homely with its familiar routines, and now the bird finds itself on the floor of a jungle, hostile, full of strange, threatening noises, creatures, trees, predators, with no sense of place or time. All the known patterns of life, the boundaries, have been savagely destroyed in a moment. Everything is now unpredictable and bewildering. Personal space has been invaded, and the basic rules and rituals of life learned to this point in time no longer exist. It is not obvious if there are any new rules at all, let alone what these new rules might be. Third, we come to what in most hands is the middle finger and the tallest. The third of the dimensions of trauma is the loss of significance. So that's the longest word. First word was security for those joining the talk. Second word, boundaries. Third word, significance. The child, abandoned, forsaken, is of no worth, a nobody. In early child's life, the identity is bound up with the significant others, with familiar toys, pets, objects, places. The I of the child, that is how a child sees herself, relies heavily on the me, which is how others see, affirm, and treat her. I'm using the description given by G.H. Mead. I, my view of myself; me, how others see me. Now the emerging fragile ego of the child is overwhelmed to the point of destruction. Perhaps the child has begun to construct a comforting imaginary world. This is common. But now not only the real world, but the imaginary world is smashed to smithereens along with the actual world in which she lives. To a young child, the absence of any known and loving person is as serious as this. I use dramatic adjectives such as shattered, smashed to smithereens as a way of expressing how serious it is. If no one recognizes the child or knows her name, if there is no one who seems to empathize with or care about her, what is there? There is in all children a primal longing for a known, friendly, smiling, and empathetic face. There's the word face now. This is part of the primal human condition, the longing for a known, friendly, smiling face. When that is taken away, the significance of the child is at existential risk. In a war zone, some children find themselves in a situation where they recognize no one and no one recognizes them. They can even be a number or just a name. With no one to take the place of the separated and lost parent, the child is as insignificant as one grain of sand on a vast beach. Fourth, so we come now to the finger, which on my hand wears a wedding ring given me by my wife, Ruth. This word, the word to put in that finger, if you can, is the word community. That's my chosen word. Other words that are already coming into being in the vocabulary of this conference are solidarity. Think of Poland. Collectivity. And a word I suggest to you, the Zulu word, Ubuntu. I am because you are. In war, the fabric of social life that has surrounded and supported the family and household of the child may be destroyed. In many ways, home and neighborhood are the world for a little child. So the important thing is, if flats, apartments, if a community is destroyed, then as far as the child is concerned, it is the world that's been destroyed. It's not part of the world, it is the whole world. So all social life has ceased to exist. Places such as a shop, a bazaar, a temple, a mosque, a church, a school, a park, a village pump, visitors such as relatives, neighbors, the milkman, and no more. It's as though the earth, the whole world of the child, has been torn to shreds. It takes a village to raise a child, and now as far as the child is concerned, that village no longer exists. In contradiction of contemporary concepts of independent, self-made human beings. By the way, one of the challenges of Ukraine is going to be the European sense of identity as distinct from the Russian and Orthodox sense, the change of the date of Christmas to fit more with the European rather than the Orthodox is a fascinating move from possibly theology to something else. Maybe you want to discuss that. But contemporary concepts, so important in Europe, of self-made individual human beings, in contradiction of these, the witness of history and research related to human development is universal. Relatedness and communal living are at the center of human life. No man is an island. When this center is removed or collapses, that's relatedness and communal living, it follows that an individual human life, physical and emotional, is at risk. Promises of help somewhere have no meaning. There's a place for you somewhere, so what? For somewhere else may never have existed in the child's experience. But if it does, it will be not part of the familiar world. It will be the other world, the strange world. And finally, last but not least, I speak, by the way, as a pianist, so the left hand, that finger is so important, particularly if you're into jazz, you know how significant that is. So the final finger is creativity or imagination. One of the words used in the first lecture yesterday was flexibility. I appreciated that, and I think creativity and imagination is part of what was meant by flexibility. As part of the reaction to the painful events in a war zone, with the shutting down of feelings, longings, and activity, is a loss of any form of creativity or imagination. That's the instinctive reaction. Memory itself may be suspended or scarred for life. There's nothing to smile about. What's the emoji that is being used in Ukraine? What's your emoji now that reflects no play? The roads and paths no longer have children skipping, hopping, running, laughing, playing on them. Have you thought of the effect this has on the grandparents and elderly? The basic blocks, the building blocks of creativity for a child, that's toys, familiar objects, books, musical instruments, they're no more. But in any case, what is there to sing about? What is there a reason for dancing? Why dance? The unbearable reality of the present predicament has sucked the air of any oxygen on which creative dreaming and imagination depend. So with these 5 elements, security, boundaries, significance, community, and creativity in view, it's apparent how painfully and completely young children suffer in war zones. Loss and separation combine with other forms of hurt to create a perfect storm. If you haven't used that phrase already, then what's happening in Ukraine is a perfect storm. The magnitude, the horror of trauma becomes terrifyingly real to any who observe it directly. When I listen to the Ukrainians begin, after their shock, to tell me what they've witnessed, I wept. I thought I could imagine the horrors of war, but when they began to speak, I realized that I was experiencing them indirectly. So part 1 of this paper has been to share with you these 5 dimensions of trauma, which are expressed in the book, The Growth of Love, and how war undermines and shatters them. Part 2 is about building the bonds of attachment and the growth of love. So we're now going to use, I don't know whether you would possibly use your other hand and draw around that. We're going to use the same words, but now in place of them being shattered, in place of these being undermined, we're going to see how it is possible to begin to respond to the child's needs and situation. So here we go. The first thing, and this is for all villages. Now, please, what I'm trying to do is say these principles apply right across Ukraine at all levels. Doesn't matter whether you're a bus driver, a fireman, a psychiatrist, a doctor, a parent, a grandparent, a teacher. These all apply. So I think the principles are those that we can share, we can use for ourselves, but share with others. Let me remind you, they all come from my personal lived experience. Secondly, from informed psychosocial therapeutic theory, but also theology. So if you asked me, if you want in questions to say, how do each of these come from theology, from Christian reading of the scriptures and so on, I will be able to give you a pretty extensive response. So security. If we're responding to the crying needs of a child, the first response must be to provide a place of safety, security. All else is subservient to this. No diversionary tactics. Look over here, little child. There's something to interest you. This safe space will resemble as closely as possible the tender and loving embrace of the child's mother. I'm thinking of the little child. It's like a haven for a boat battered and dismasted by a storm. I speak to you also as a sailor who's experienced what it is to be in a battered boat dismasted by a storm. In war zones, there are limited options for security or safe space for a child, in that a school, a hospital, a refugee camp could be at risk of bombing, but they won't remotely replace the makeup of what the child has lost. If there is a member of a child's family, say parents have been lost, a close and familiar neighbor needs to be identified, the child entrusted to them. If a child is injured and in hospital, the regime of the hospital needs to be organized to meet this fundamental need, not just medical responses, but the child's loss of security. Otherwise, everyone is a stranger. There can't be just a succession of nurses or doctors on a rota. The child is looking for a consistent face that recognizes her, is attuned to her, and will weep or smile with her. Empathy. What goes to make up a safe space or security is not primarily about physical location or the characteristics of a building, but the creation of environment that a child feels to be non-threatening and responsive to her basic feelings and needs. One such place, this is responding to the trauma of sexual exploitation and trafficking in the Philippines, is one I've experienced. It's called the Round Home. I could share more with you if you wanted to know about that. But that's a physical environment and a social environment and a spiritual environment constructed to avoid any rough edges. There are no sharp edges in the round home. And I think when we're trying to provide security or safe space, that's good news for a child. It's somehow a hospital ward or a tent can still be a place where there aren't sharp edges, so the child can be reassured. Transitional objects such as toys or personal effects or even pets are important to a child. What if you're trying to treat a child in a hospital and a child has a pet? Do you say, sorry, there's a risk of disease from the pet, or can the child hold the pet? Question. So I want to move on to the second, because I just feel it's going to be important to discuss these in different contexts. The second, boundaries. So how can we begin to re-establish boundaries? How can, so that love might grow? All the time, what I'm getting to is that the child might experience love growing post-trauma. Integral to the establishment of security in the form of safe space is the creation of reliable, friendly rhythms, rituals, and patterns of life. The sooner, the better. The behavior of significant adults or young people alongside the child need to be predictable, reliable, child-friendly. No shouting or outbursts of temper. This is a challenge in war zones. Promises not made lightly. Truth spoken quietly. A yes means yes. A no means no. No false promises. No utopias promised. This is equally important for a child, a yes and a no. Quite often since the book, The Growth of Love, people have been they found it revolutionary to discover how important the word no can be for the security of a child. Not the no shouted out, but the no which simply says, no, that will not happen, or whatever it may be. So rhythms, routines, rituals are the stuff of this sensitively bounded daily life of the child. And where possible, they will mirror or connect with her previous experience. Where not, because someone doesn't know what the previous experience was, they will be attuned to her feelings, reactions, responses, and needs and wishes. Another phrase I offer to you is the phrase seasons of the day. Seasons of the year, in certainly your part of the world and mine, are something, seasons of the year we understand, not just with Vivaldi and his music. But a child lives through a day, and who knows how long a day is in a traumatized child's life. From the dark hours of the night, winter, through dawn, spring, summer, midday, and autumn evening. Memorably, there was this reference yesterday to the going to bed, and how for someone in Ukraine, that was like saying goodbye. You didn't know whether you wake up. It was almost like a metaphor of an experience of possible death. So the seasons of a day I offer to you, thinking through the day. Perhaps a key aspect of the boundaries is that they are lived boundaries. So the responsible villagers in Ukraine who live close to the child aren't giving the child rules, but they're living the boundaries. They are walking the walk, not just talking talk. Now we come to the third of these, hopefully you've written them down, of these dimensions of trauma: significance. How, if we're building the safe space which has boundaries and rhythms of daily life, how do we provide significance? The search continues for the person who will take the place of the missing or lost mother or parent. Of course, if the mother or parent is still there, they will be supported. The scenarios will be infinitely varied. A mother may be injured, sick, traumatized. Responses need to be sensitive and practical. There are many permutations. You might want to discuss some of these later. But what we need is someone who the child can trust over time, who cares for the child unconditionally. Now, this sets the bar very high. How on earth can we ensure in a war zone there is someone unconditionally committed to a child? But I ask, how can we set the bar any lower? Where a mother has died or is absent, the child's world has been shattered. The heart of the mother no longer beats. The center of the world no longer holds. In some aspects, what is lost is irreplaceable. It was in the mother's womb the child grew and developed. It was at the mother's breast the child fed. It was into the mother's face the child gazed. And it was the mother's smiles and frowns that returned the feeling of the child. That dance is over. Someone else needs to begin to take the child into their tender embrace. And there cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution to this for finding the significant other. There are trite examples where conferences have said adoption is the answer, fostering is the answer. Residential institutions, the answer. There is no one size fits all. This is just something where we're seeking to find a person and people who are attuned to a child with a chemistry. This is the relationship, the therapeutic relationship between the child and that person. It could be members of a family, neighbors, a teacher from a day Sunday school, a nun, an adult care in a children's home, other young people, older brothers, sisters, uncles, aunties, who knows? But that person needs to be found. We come to the fourth of the dimensions, back to the fourth finger, which is community. As I said to you, solidarity, collectivity, Ubuntu, village. Only when the child is secure with this person having been identified, this person in place, can reconstruction of the community that makes up the child's social life get underway. And this needs to proceed at the child's pace, not passively asking their wishes, but anticipating and being responsive to the child. Wherever possible, the child should be invited to be part of the process of recreating that community. Building a home together is one of the best ways of relating to others. So my friends in Ukraine, building from the rubble together is one of the best ways of creating solidarity. The process can't be rushed. And so a practical experience of this, it's not right to expect a child to go immediately back to preschool or school. There needs to be a time of re-establishing relationships, just as there are in different parts of the world following grief and bereavement, periods of mourning. It's so important, the idea that, oh, let's get the child back to school as quickly as possible. There needs to be sensitivity. And this is where villages kick in, the idea of a village. People around who have a sensitivity to the child and see themselves as potential villagers. So in place of bombs and shells and shrieks of pain, the chaos of people running in all directions, sirens, fire engines, collapsing buildings, the need to be for the child, people aware and responsive to the child, crucially, critically engaged in repairing and keeping the village together. This is existential, not just talking about one level or another. And finally, last but not least, the little finger in creating the potential environment for the growth of love. We come to the little finger, creativity. I think you've already come to this in this conference, and let's see how it develops right through to Paul Fiddy's last paper, the one on war poetry. Creativity. This is a sense of play, engagement, a wish to make, to create, as distinct from destroy, deface, or flee. This may in time emerge. It's one of the surest ways of finding whether a child is finding security and boundaries. It's finding, have they got a sense of humor? Is there a desire to sing, to dance, to move, to draw, to make, to explore, to imagine beautiful things again, to connect with birdsong or with a pet? Such creativity is essential to the process of development of the child, but also a byproduct of it. War has the effect of defacing, warping, destroying every aspect of a child's world. By imaginative play, this includes role play, drama, a child may begin to take her place again as a partner in creation, a caretaker, perhaps looking after a pet, looking after flowers, looking after fruit, part of the harvest in Ukraine, part of the fields which the world looks to, and particularly the continent of Africa, for feeding, for food. The village, which for many young children is their known world, may in effect be a microcosm of the planet, and perhaps even a kindergarten. I won't develop this idea, but creating a children's garden where the child begins to feel at home again. This whole process, that is creating the environment in which love can grow, takes time. But the good news from my experience at Millgrove, where I was born, living with children who've suffered loss and separation, is that love has grown. So I'm able to say to you, I've seen it. I don't understand why or how, but I've seen it happen. In part 3 of what I want to share with you, I'd just like to focus on, identify some of the elements of this process of creating an environment in which love can grow using the 5 dimensions that I've drawn from psychosocial experience and knowledge. That is psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychology, the development of, this is also educational theory. And so let me just share with you some of this, and then I'll go on to part 4, which is the theological. I think that I want to go to the theological as quickly as possible. First, I'd like to say, drawing from psychosocial theory and experience, therapeutic support is critically important. So Ruth, my wife, and I have been supported for 40 years by a consultant psychotherapist. Now, we're able to be available to children who are suffering trauma, to live with them 24/7, to share their pain, and in some way to cope with our own feelings and responses without becoming angry or defensive, because of one of the things is the therapeutic support we've encountered. There is someone called Dan Hughes. If you want, his work is referred to in my paper and my book. He's a psychotherapist whose groundbreaking work, building the bonds of emotional attachment, I think is one of those things that applies to a war zone in Ukraine. How do you begin the process of building these bonds? Something that occurred, I think has been talked about already in this conference, is the relation of the body of the child or the body of a person to the real world. And I think something that's really important is that therapeutic support can help interpret and help with that connection of the body, which houses the mind and the emotions of the child, and the real world. So I want to say we're setting this in the context of a real child and the real world. The second thing I draw attention to is the place of education and learning. And my preferred word for education is learning. Anything that doesn't have to do with educational establishments, schools and colleges, learning. There is an assumed divide between carers and teachers, home and school, as far as learning is concerned. But a child in Ukraine suffering in the war zone is absorbing and processing sights and sounds, absolutely confusing at all ends of the spectrum, and they need to learn to interpret and cope with them in the round. So mothers and carers and neighbors, as well as teachers and therapists and ministers and Sunday school teachers, need to be part of this learning process. Where there are wounds and trauma, it's really important what sort of contact there is between home and school, for example, between Sunday school and household. Attunement between teachers and parents is as important as between the child and the parent. So not separate worlds. The child goes from home to school and no one knows how the child is being helped with the learning. This is beginning to come to terms with the trauma. So professional support for teachers as well as for parents is essential. Third thing I want to draw attention to is the importance in this whole process of creating an environment in which love can grow, which is the importance of life stories. That is, holding on to the life story of the child, and that includes the family of the child. There is no single way of doing this, but please hold on to the fact that we need to recognize there is a risk of the child falling into a void and the life story being lost. So the village that is parenting a child needs to pay attention to the child's story. The child can help in this, not least by pictures and memories, whatever it may be. Fourth thing is the place of sympathetic and contented adults. this is a simple observation I make to you, which is how in my experience worldwide, have I seen children most contented and happy, most safe? It is not where someone is deliberately speaking to them, consciously doing something for them. It is counterintuitively where adults are content with each other, could be grandparents and parents or neighbors and friends, and where the child is in a space, perhaps in a cot, in a room playing with a toy or a pet, and no one is directly contacting the child, trying to draw attention to themselves or the child, but where the child is part of a safe enough environment, where the child is in a place where there is a sense of contentedness and well-being. How wonderful if that could be a church or a Sunday school, a park, a school. How wonderful if a classroom could be a space where a teacher isn't teaching a child, but where the teacher is content and there is contentedness, there is a sense. Anyway, I want to share that with you because so often people are conscious of wanting to do something for a child or to a child, responding and so on. And I'm wanting to say that this recreates much of the time that a suckling baby is with her child and the mother isn't conscious of suckling the child. The mother isn't conscious of breathing and being attuned to the child. There is a togetherness. Next thing I want to draw attention to is resilience. This has been referred to, resilience. I have to say to you, I see it and I rejoice in it, but I can't understand it. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. Oh, children are resilient. Children vary in their resilience. But the encouraging thing is that children are more resilient than I have to remind myself of the resilience of children. I have to remind myself, they remind me of that. I can hardly believe it. But sometimes when I feel things are bleak, unpromising, I discover resilience in children. Next thing to mention to you that I think is important, this is as resources to draw on, is the importance of play and experimenting and exploration. We've already talked about this, but one thing I mention here is when I've talked to children and listened to their life stories around the world, would you believe it? Children have often, when they become adults, have talked about how they enjoyed playing in the rubble of war zones. Now, you might find this surprising, and there are obvious risks where there are mines and so on, but it is a fact that people, I've got on record recordings of people say again and again, I most enjoyed playing among the rubble of a war zone. I mention that to you because we might always think of formal games and sport and floodlights and playing and so on and getting the right environment. And isn't it extraordinary that children will play not just with Lego, but also with the rubble and can use their imagination? There is something extraordinary about a response to suffering where a child takes the rubble and says, I will make something of this. I'm enjoying playing with what has been the aggressor's attempt to destroy. It's like a poet making a poem out of disaster, or someone, a comedian, possibly Zelensky, making play, drawing satire, and so in that way reconfiguring things, taking rubble. A project in Manila in the Philippines I've been involved with started with the play of street children in the most basic ways, using what they had as a way of establishing safe space. And finally, if I could offer to you the notion of times and seasons, I'm conscious that the harvest season has come to Ukraine and it's been bittersweet with what's happening in Odessa and other ports has been happening, and the harvest not being harvested, or at times the harvest being destroyed. Times and seasons, I offer this to you. In the book of the Growth of Love, I try to undermine the notion that there are developmental predictable stages for child development, and particularly predictable stages for grief. That's not my experience. I'm always surprised. So there are twists and turns. But healing, love has its own seasons, just as nature with the weather, flora, fauna, creatures, the human species, periods of gestation, times when the land lies fallow, spurts of growth, ripening harvest. What I want to say with you is there are times and seasons, and we cannot impose, whether we're teachers or therapists or parents, we can't impose our time scale. We have to be attuned to the seasons of the child. Now, part 4, if you're following me on this, I'm wanting to say what we draw from theological and Christian resources. And what I'll do is give you a menu so we can, in the hopefully ensuing discussion, we can develop these further. So what can we draw from Christian resources? Now, you find this quite basic, but the first is the Bible. I'm holding here a Bible that was designed for children worldwide for whom English is a second language, children who've experienced trauma. It was designed for my own family, the household at Mill Grove. And the reason I spent 30 years working on a Bible for children and families who were traumatized was because I discovered that the Bible was overlooked. Overlooked by church, overlooked by theologians. You might say this is all strange, but look, let me put it to you like this. Here are 2 aspects of the biblical testimony overlooked. The first is that children feature all through the Bible. And yet, if you go to systematic theology, you will find sometimes the word child is absent from start to finish. If you look at seminaries and seminary courses, the word child is absent, but in the Bible, children figure all through. So if children are reading or have read to them the Bible, what they will find is their own story connecting with the Bible stories. Now, please hear, I'm not wanting in any way to sanitize and so on, just the whole Bible. This is the Bible with the rough edges still there. The Bible is full of children suffering because of the effects of conflict and war. Moses would have been killed as a baby were it not for the presence and quick thinking of his sister Miriam. David was sent by his father to a war zone, taking bread and cheese to his older 3 brothers. He then found himself in the epicenter of battle. The unnamed slave girl who was instrumental in the healing of the enemy army commander Naaman had been taken captive during a hostile raid on her territory. My sisters and brothers, the Bible is full of stories which, as if children haven't been protected from it, if they haven't just been given a sanitized version of the Bible, they will discover that the Bible connects with their real experience. Often this element of the biblical narrative is overlooked or marginalized. Stories at Sunday school, stories in children's Bibles are nearly always adaptations of the text. And a feature is it always softens the harsh realities of the originals. If you're hurting in Ukraine, there are people hurting in the Bible, and you can connect with them. Children suffering trauma, if they read the Bible and hear the Bible, discover here is something that's not ideal. This bears resemblance to what they're encountering day by day. But the second aspect of the biblical testimony that is overlooked is that it's a cosmic battle. So how else do we describe the narrative of the Bible apart from a cosmic battle? The full picture is one of a battle between light and darkness. Think of Ukraine, the times when the lights went out, truth and falsehood. Dictators of kingdoms and empires and the living God. Human greed. The well-being of the created world. That's at stake. The world suffering, the land suffering. Much that was written in the Bible could be set within Ukraine over the past 500 days since the invasion began. Rape, torture, mutilation, terror tactics, mass destruction, genocide, the like. The Bible is not a fairy story depicting an idealized world or characters. It's not sagas with great heroes. So often they're presented. I was brought up as a boy on the great men of God. When I started getting to know the Bible, I found those men had feet of clay. The depravity of sin is starkly evident all through Genesis to Revelation. This means then that the message of the Bible is wonderfully good news, because ultimately in the catastrophe, as Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien said, there is eucatastrophe. It turns round. The resurrection turns things on its head. The Bible is ultimately a testimony of faith, hope, and love, represented in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Death, darkness, ugliness, falsehood are not the victors. Where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. This is the good news. There is demonstrable hope, despite the sorry state of the world caused by human willfulness and rebellion. There is persistent inclination to ignore the Creator's instructions, but in his grace and mercy, the Creator continues to love. There are seeds germinating, buds appearing, fruits ripening, and children gestating in the womb, and children like Tamalayan born in the conflict in Ukraine. Harvest with its justice and peace is promised. Villagers who are seeking comfort, encouragement, and reassurance at times of oppression and conflict will find in the Bible, that's the Bible from start to finish, a source of peace, shalom found nowhere else. This is where children have a God-given well of living water to draw from, and that's why the Bible is at the heart of our life at Mill Grove. This Bible is unabridged. It's all there. The rape, the genocide is all there. So children and readers can follow the narrative from themselves without gatekeepers presuming to know what is best for them. So the first resource from the Christian tradition, theology, the church, is the Bible. The second is Christian households, churches, and organizations. Please notice the order. Professional clergy start with churches and then go on to other things. But it's Christian households, churches, and organizations in that order. The corporate expression of the gospel of Jesus Christ in the form of households, fellowships, congregations, missions, organizations, groups, networks, residential communities, all committed in some way or form to following Jesus or serving others. That's what I'm trying to describe. People are trying to follow Jesus. This is where lived theology alone is to be found. Every aspect of human frailty and pride, sadly, can be found within each of these groups, including my own household, Mill Grove. But by God's mercy and grace, the light of God still shines in this extraordinary collection of people, for whom the cross represents forgiveness, redemption, and healing, and Easter Day represents the promise of the ultimate victory of love over hate. An injunction to all of God's people, running right through the scriptures, as you know, is that they should welcome orphans, widows, and strangers. Start with the Pentateuch, go through to the book of James, and you find this all through. This is not as an act of charity. Moses is so insistent on pointing this out to his people. Don't do this out of charity or thought of reward. It is because we are all one in Christ Jesus. There is no other. The story of the outsider, the orphan, the widow, the stranger is my story. It's your story. This is our story. This is the story Jesus became. This is his story. He was an outsider. He was an orphan. He spoke of his Father, my God, why have you left me? He was a stranger. The first and last, the great and little, the inside and the outside are all deconstructed in the kingdom of God. I haven't mentioned Miroslav Volf, but we'll come to him. At times of conflict, these groups, both within the war zone and outside, are available and ready to help. This conference represents an attempt to draw on the resources of the Christian family. Then we come to child theology. This is the next of the things I want to recommend to you as a resource. Child theology and the theology of suffering. The theology of the poor, liberation theology, dates back to something like the 1960s, the 1970s. We come to feminist theology, then womanist theology, and we come to the theology of those with disability, and it goes on and on and on. These have all developed over my lifetime. Child theology didn't start hitting the road till 2001. It came late in time. It came after the others. But since 2001, there's been an international network of academics, practitioners seeking to develop theological insights by being child attentive, that's my favorite term, in their reading and interpretation of the scriptures and their engagement with children in the contemporary world. The website of the Child Theology Movement is available, full of resources. More is being put on there. And there are, for some reason, seminaries are coming late to this and still haven't realized how much resource there is. So child theology, I'm happy to speak more of it. One of the books I was sharing earlier on, the most sustained attempt to do child theology to date, is called Entry Point. It's a sustained theological study of Matthew chapter 18, available via Amazon and Kindle, and by Professor Haddon Wilmer and myself. It took us the best part of 12 years to do this work on 18 verses of Matthew's Gospel. The other part of theology I want to draw attention to was the theology of suffering. It's at times like these in Ukraine where surely nothing does, apart from the likes of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Miroslav Volf. I remember talking to a former student of mine from Spurgeon's College who was going through darkness, basically, and I went to be with him and said, "How are things?" He said, "Bad, bleak." And nothing else would do but the wounded healer, Henri Nouwen. The wounded healer. Nothing else would do. In other words, bringing consolation, saying there, was a bit like, if you know the Snoopy cartoons, God bless you, Snoopy, God bless you. That's trite. It's when there is someone who you know knows what the void is like, that there is comfort. So it's when we're at the cross, surely one of the things we do is to draw comfort from the fact that he knows, my Lord and Savior Jesus knows. And please, in Ukraine, if those of us outside cannot connect with the reality of suffering for you, please hear that if you kneel at the foot of the cross with Jesus, then he surely understands. So I wanted to mention those resources to you. I'd love to develop them if we can. And by conclusion, let me say this. This paper is offered in solidarity with my sisters and brothers in Ukraine. If I could be with you on the ground, I would. I recognize the infinite number of permutations of suffering, trauma, and the social realities. That's why I've suggested 5 dimensions that can apply whatever the permutations. That's the whole point. Not that these rise above it, but that these can be applied within it. It's underwritten by the conviction that theory is ultimately irrelevant without committed and compassionate people in a child's life. And with the acknowledgement, there are many players and factors in a war zone. There are many villages, and there are levels at which these principles can be understood and applied for those seeking help. I have no interest in merely academic theology, only the theology that is underpinned by living faith. I've mentioned Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I go back, and Henri Nouwen. I go back ultimately to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. What I've shared with you comes from a weather-beaten practitioner. The term weather-beaten is known by sailors. I said I'm a sailor. If I'm going to be with a skipper in a boat, and I often am, I don't want to know the qualifications of the skipper. I don't want to know what she has read. I want to know whether they've survived storms. And all I'm saying to you is that my life has been alongside traumatized children in a setting where we've tried to learn and to understand, and in the most unlikely social compost. Another word I offer to you, a term, is social compost. I think somehow we're trying to create in Ukraine eventually the social compost in which love in children will grow. Millgrove bears all the hallmarks of a weather-beaten and the frailties of a human endeavor, but it has endured for 123 years. You can come and stay at Millgrove if you'd like to when the war is over. We have access to what happens in a child's lifetime. Her life as a parent, grandparents, great-grandparents. I'm meeting them and in contact with them even today. Grandchildren of children who lived at Millgrove, and seeing how love has grown and trauma has been overcome. It's an extended household set in an urban neighborhood with motorways within earshot. It functions in many ways like a village where each child and each adult is seen as contributing to the dynamics of the place and its community. But I want to end with this. There have been setbacks and, humanly speaking, failures. Please understand that. But the fact is that I have seen love grow. And it's such a joy to record that this includes the little Ukrainian boy who came to live with us in February 2023 from Kharkiv. He thrived at Millgrove. He found it a secure environment, a safe space. He found that he gained confidence. The boundaries and the rituals were predictable. He was with his mother. He was born, by the way, in Bulgaria on the way fleeing from Kharkiv. He was with his mother, traumatized, but she also began to relax. He learned to walk, to fall over. He held my hand and began to trust me. He played happily with others. He played with people without language from different cultures, different colors of skin. He found reaffirming, predictable boundaries after the chaos and random nature of life and events on the long journey from Kharkiv. He was reunited miraculously with his father when he came to London. The little boy had his father and mother with him. They were attuned. The community of Millgrove supported them in their parenting, didn't take over, encouraged them as villagers when they were distressed, and they were, when they were despairing, when the wounds started leaking, threatening to overwhelm them, we were there. Sometimes it was just being with them, certainly not saying anything to them, listening to their stories, almost incomprehensible in their ugliness. People dying, body parts in their memories, blood on the ground, blood on their clothing. All of this was coming out. But in Millgrove, there was space and time for the little boy to experiment, to play by himself and with others. I've got lots of photographs of him, and some are with others and some are by himself, and some he's by himself in the midst of lots of people. He's centered. So as a Christian household, Millgrove seeks to live and do theology, drawing deeply from many others, past and present, Christians and non-Christians. It's so important. I don't see anyone having a monopoly of wisdom and truth. Professionals and lay people, all making up, whether consciously or not, the village that it takes to raise a child like little Tamerlane, born into and living through the trauma of war. His story is not over, but I have witnessed love growing in his life. Our testimony is that often the main agents of healing, forgiveness, and love are the children who've been traumatized. The final word is therefore one spelt hope. Look, I find that very, very often it is about music, it is about singing, and it's Bible stories. So yesterday, the whole of my experience is lived. So I was with children yesterday, children who've suffered trauma, and one of the things, a little boy was with me. I was the piano. Sometimes it's the guitar, sometimes it's the piano, and I was singing the song, "The wise man built his house upon the rock." And I don't know whether you know it, but the wise man built his house upon the rock. Some of you may. And then the foolish man built his house upon the sand, and the rain came tumbling down. And that's the story of Jesus. It's that people have referred to the Sermon on the Mount, but it's their part of the Sermon on the Mount. But I mean, that's important preparation, isn't it? The rain came tumbling down. The rain came down and the floods went up. That's preparation, if you see what I mean. I mean, it's real life. And the house on the sand fell flat. So we don't have to go very far from the very heart of the teaching of Jesus before we discover that we've got that which engages with the real world. And so we've got simple song and that sort of thing. And I think the other thing is Bible stories. So yesterday we were thinking about, would you believe it, Romans chapter 8. Yeah, you might find that astonishing if you're doing it with little children, but we were thinking about how creation is like a mummy, a mother who's beginning to get near the time when the baby is born, and the mummy is experiencing pain. And so we had a mother there, the mother of the boy, and we were able to talk about birth pangs. And so we were able to talk about pain. All I'm trying to say is that was Romans 8. Paul's talking about birth pangs and creation, and there we are talking about it. It's simply about, what can I say? Is it too heavy to say incarnational? It's about, look, let's be real. And it's very much listening to what children are saying. This boy, I remember when war started in Ukraine, I mean, one of the collateral effects was this boy said, there are bombs in the London Underground. There are bombs in the London Underground. Now, there weren't. There were bombs in Ukraine, but for him, he hadn't got a geography which had Ukraine far away, and he thought they were falling. He lives, by the way, very near a station, so he thought there were bombs falling. So it's just important to think that the trauma, those of us who are outside Ukraine, some of the children are very much inside. And so I'm thinking of permeable boundaries between a child's experience, dreams, and the scriptures and the life we share together. I don't know whether that helps, but it's about genuine communication. If a mother holding a child, let's say the mother has got news that her husband has died in the fighting, and now she's got to protect the child and she's got her own feelings, clearly she's got to protect her own feelings and protect her child. I mean, this is the way it is. But there's not a one-fit-all solution. The mother needs to be supported by others. And so this is where extended families, neighbors, and so on come in. The whole point about a village being necessary in a war zone, but it seems to me right. But you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things a parent or a carer will do is try to protect a child instinctively, and there are times and seasons. There are times for protecting in that way, but then it's being guided by the child. It's when the child says, "Where's daddy?" when the child asks questions, that's when surely we know. Well, you say, what if? I mean, this happens everywhere, doesn't it? So whether we're teachers in Sunday schools, and that was me, by the way, in Sunday school. That's how I was. But so please, just to say that this is one of the ways in which children respond to trauma. Not, there are different ways, but obviously that's one of the ways. And so please understand that at Mill Grove, this is bread and butter. This is how things are. And then there are real levels of challenge. And Dan Hughes, in his book, Building the Bonds of Attachment, is starting from a base where there is no boundary, the child has no respect for understanding of boundaries and respect. And so it's a long, long process. And at Mill Grove, we've sought over the years to construct a place where the building is the same building since 1899, and where the story continues. It's finding what boundaries do work to, I haven't used this word a lot, but the word to hold a child, another word is contain. They're difficult words, they have baggage with them, but somehow a child needs to know that there is something secure that means they simply can't destroy everything and then knock down all boundaries. My father used to talk about the significance of rubber walls, and by that what he meant was trying to find ways of constructing boundaries around a child like that, so when the child encountered the boundaries, they didn't get hurt. So that's a concept, the concept of rubber walls. And there's something really important, which is about forgiveness. We haven't talked about forgiveness, but Miroslav Volf, obviously in his book, Exclusion and Embrace, is forgiveness possible when your people have been the victim of effectively genocide? And I think that we, theologically, we're talking here about something where the adults in the situation are going to forgive again and again and again. But this isn't to say to the child, just walk over us and walk over everything, but to provide somehow boundaries, but they're ones where always there will be that forgiveness. Look, it's a lifelong thing. I don't have an answer to it, but only that it is that the growing child needs the boundaries, and you have to find out how you can find them. One of the ways, role play is one of those ways, by the way, if I can just say practically from my own experience. So when I'm really toiling and finding that, let's say we're playing a game of, can we say football for a moment? We had Scott, an Australian, giving a paper just a short time ago, and then I'm English, and we've just had a cricket match, you may know, or may not, between the two countries. But if we imagine football, and we have someone who is playing and they're hurting others and they're disobeying the rules, one of the things I try to do is to make them a referee. So make them responsible for the rules, try to turn the boundaries around, try to say, now look, if I were you or someone else were you, what would you do to them if they were doing this? So look, so Charles broken a window. Right now, if that were your window, what would you do to the person? So it's trying all the time to find ways, but just to say, be ready for the long haul. I think I'm just trying to gather up what others have said rather than anything I've said. There's rich experience and theological and lived already in the participants. So what a wonderful thing. Just without seeming repetitive, to say that we have the scriptures. Where else do we find the words of eternal life? So if you're thinking long term, then the notion of, how can I put it, taking the Bible seriously is something that we can all do during the event, but long term. I think the something important is recognizing in the village, that is the village which includes Christian, those of other faiths and those of no faith, professionals and lay people. I think that concept of it takes a village to raise a child is a very healthy one. So not that a child should come to church 7 days a week, so that Samuel is the model for all children. They should all go and live in a church. Not the church has all the activities for children and so on, but that there is some concept of, I think it's there in the scriptures, and certainly in the letters of Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, as to how the Christian community has different parts to it, those set apart for ministry to the Gentiles, those to the Jews in Jerusalem and Antioch and so on, but also the households of faith, that is the household of Lydia, the Aquila and Priscilla, the different households, and how church and household, I think of them as both households of faith, how they can have a better relationship where there is an openness in the place of worship, the gathered community of the church, among the theologians, listening to and receiving the questions, a better balance between that and worship in everyday life, and the seminaries and what they're doing. There were two, I've learned many things on the journey of child theology. I've traveled to every continent. One of the things with a seminary that was considering, I won't say where it was, but this is a true story, needing to reinvent itself. It couldn't carry on. Seminaries are undergoing change, not least since COVID in the world. And it decided to close its doors and dismantle its library. And a few of its faculty went on the road to churches and said to Christian communities, "We're seminarians, how can we help?" And the response was incredulity, which is, what do you mean help? Seminaries aren't there to help the church, would you believe? Seminaries are where we send people. Anyway, so there was a concept of seminary. And the notion that seminarians were coming to say, how can we help, was for churches astonishing. And I think many households would say, wow, do seminaries come to households and say, what are the real issues for you? A seminary is coming, a theologian's coming to you. What are the issues for you? The surprise was that the response was, well, if you really want to help us, there are two things you can help us with. First is, can you help us to know how to organize a church? Because under the Soviet regime, I'm not going to say where this was, but under the Soviet regime, we didn't learn how to organize ourselves. It was all done for us. So seminaries hadn't even started where the people were. And the other was, can you help us care for the elderly? So this is saying to the theologians, help us organize church and help us care for the elderly. And I think they're both hugely proper questions. They're appropriate questions. So what you're saying, after the long term, it seems to me that every part of the church needs to be alive. The seminaries, the professional, the priests, the professional theologians, the ministers, the church. But where the action is all the time is in the households of faith. That is the families in the households. And for some reason, I've lectured at Spurgeon's College since 1978, as you know. For some reason, the syllabus, the theology, continues to get focused on the gathered church, the church, meaning whatever, the denomination and so on, and not so much on the households. And the point about child theology is that we're saying now, if we're going to be child attentive, where does the child spend most of her time? The answer is in the household. So that's where the support needs to be. It's how much effort, how much support is there for people wanting to share the Bible. So while I'm away as a theologian in different parts of the world, by the way, Ukraine is one of the few places I haven't been to. I've been to many places. My wife is thrilled that we have a Bible that's designed for households where people aren't professional theologians. And the way the text is divided means that a mother or a grandparent or an older sibling, if they can read, they know exactly how the Bible is organized. Now, that's a way, in my view, of providing the very best resource for those who are suffering long-term from trauma.